Obedience to authority. The study of when and why people obey the commands or instructions of someone in authority has been dominated by the most famous set of social psychology experiments ever conducted, those of Stanley Milgram, previously discussed in chapters 1 and 5. Milgram's experiments are so well known, in fact, that the social psychologist Lee Ross says they have become part of our society's shared intellectual legacy, that small body of historical incidents, biblical parables, and classic literature that serious thinkers feel free to draw on when they debate about human nature or contemplate human history. The setup of the Milgram experiments. Milgram's research on obedience began as an investigation of conformity. Milgram was interested in whether the kind of pressures observed in Ash's conformity experiment were powerful enough to lead people to do something far more significant than report an incorrect line length. He wondered what would happen if he asked participants to deliver electric shocks whenever a subject performing a task, in reality the experimenter's confederate, responded incorrectly. Would participants conform to the example set by other obedient participants, even when doing so involved hurting another human being? This is an interesting question, but Milgram never pursued it. The reason is that he first needed to obtain data from a control group to determine the willingness of participants to deliver electric shocks in the first place when there was no pressure to conform, and that's where he got his surprising result, one that radically changed his research agenda. A large percentage of participants were willing to do something they thought was hurting another person, even when there was no group of other participants leading the way. Stanley Milgram. Using a shock generator that looked real but was actually just a prop, Milgram studied whether participants would continue to obey instructions and deliver electric shocks to a learner, even when they thought the learner was in grave distress. Recall from Chapter 1 the basic procedure of Milgram's experiments. After responding to a newspaper ad, participants showed up for an experiment on learning. The setup was rigged so the participant was always assigned to the role of the teacher, and the confederate to the role of the learner. The teacher's job was to administer an electric shock every time the learner, a genial middle-aged man who was strapped into a chair with his arm attached to a pretend shock generator, made a mistake by reporting the wrong word from a list of word pairs, such as glove, book, grill, detergent, anvil, pope. The Milgram experiment. Participants were led to believe that the shock generator had 30 levels of shock, ranging from slight shock to danger, severe shock, to XXX. A participant being given a sample shock of 45 volts. This was the only real shock in the experiment. B, a participant standing up to ask the experimenter if he could stop the experiment. Teachers were briefly strapped to the chair themselves and given a 45-volt shock so they would know the shocks were painful. The teacher started off by delivering 15 volts after the learner's first mistake, then increased the shock in 15-volt increments after each subsequent mistake. As the mistakes accumulated, participants found themselves required to deliver 255, 300, and 330 volts of electricity, all the way up to 450 volts. In reality, no electric shock was delivered to the learner. If a participant expressed reservations or tried to terminate the experimenter would respond with a carefully scripted set of responses. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue, and you have no other choice. You must go on. The great surprise in these studies was how many participants continued to obey the experimenter's orders and deliver the maximum level of shock to the confederate, box 9.3. In the remote feedback version of the experiment, in which the learner was in an adjoining room and could not be heard except when he vigorously pounded on the wall, after a shock of 300 volts, 66% of the participants continued the learning experiment and delivered the maximum shock of 450 volts. In the voice feedback version, the participants could hear a series of increasingly desperate pleas by the learner, including screaming that he had a heart condition, until finally, ominously, he became silent. Despite the many cues that the learner was suffering, 62.3% of the participants delivered the maximum shock. Opposing forces. Milgram's participants were caught in an agonizing conflict. On the one hand were forces compelling them to complete the experiment and continue delivering shock. Among these forces was a sense of fair play. They had agreed to serve as participants, they had already received payment for doing so, and they felt they now had to fulfill their part of the bargain. Some were probably also motivated by the reason they'd agreed to participate in the first place, to advance science and the understanding of human behavior. Normative social influence was also likely at play. In this case, the desire to avoid the disapproval of the experimenter or anyone else associated with the study. Closely related to this concern was the very human desire to avoid making a scene and upsetting others. On the other hand, several powerful forces compelled participants to want to terminate the experiment. Foremost among these was the moral imperative to stop the suffering of the learner. Participants may have felt a specific desire not to hurt the genial man they had met earlier, as well as a more abstract reluctance to hurt others. Some were also probably concerned about what would happen if something went wrong. What if he dies or is permanently injured? Will there be a lawsuit? Still others may have wondered about the prospect of having to walk out with the learner after everything was over, and the resulting embarrassment they might feel or possible retaliation from the learner. Understanding these opposing forces leads to a better understanding of why participants responded the way they did and why the whole experience was so stressful. How might the rate of obedience change if the strength of these opposing forces were modified? This is exactly the question Milgram tried to answer through a comprehensive series of studies in which he conducted important variations on his original studies. Reactance theory, the idea that people reassert their prerogatives in response to the unpleasant state of arousal they experience when they believe their freedoms are threatened. Box 9.3, focus on positive psychology, resisting social influence. People don't always conform, comply, and obey. They sometimes engage in heartening, even heroic, acts of independence, refusing to go along with misguided peers, defying the illegitimate demands of a commanding officer, or blowing the whistle on unethical business practices. What enables people to hold their ground, follow their conscience, and resist being influenced by others? The pressure to give in to others can be offset by the tendency to resist attempts to restrict freedom of action or thought, according to reactance theory. People experience an unpleasant state of arousal when they believe their free will is threatened, and they often act to reduce this discomfort by reasserting their prerogatives. 1956. If your parents tell you you mustn't dye your hair, does your desire to dye it diminish or increase? Reactance theory predicts that the moment you feel your freedom is being taken away, it becomes more precious and your desire to maintain it increases. Once motivated to resist, what factors might increase someone's ability to stand firm? One important variable is practice. In Milgram's obedience studies, many participants wanted to disobey and even tried to do so, but they weren't very good at it. Maybe if they had been trained to disobey when the situation called for it, they would have done a better job. There is evidence that the Christians who tried to save Jews during the Holocaust tended to be people who had a history of helping others, either as part of their job or as volunteers. Those who helped the most often didn't have any higher regard for their Jewish neighbors than those who helped less. They were simply more practiced in reaching out and providing aid. Another way to increase the ability to resist social influence is to have an ally. In Ash's conformity experiment, having just one additional person who departed from the majority was enough to reduce conformity rather dramatically. Indeed, the most important lesson of Ash's research is just how difficult it can be to be the lone holdout. People also need to be wary of potentially slippery slopes. The stepwise procedure in Milgram's experiments may have played an important role in the surprising levels of obedience observed in these studies. It's often easiest to resist influence from the start, rather than giving in and hoping to put a stop to things later on. As the Catholic Church teaches, avoid the near occasion of sin. It's important to keep in mind, too, that many social influence attempts are based on appeals to emotion, as we discussed earlier. A particularly effective strategy for dealing with emotion-based approaches is simply to put off a response. If there is a first law of emotional experience, it is that emotions fade and moods change. Therefore, the compulsion to give in because you are caught up in a particular emotion can be diminished simply by waiting to respond. After the initial feelings dissipate, you can then decide whether to comply with the request on the merits of the idea, not on the basis of a bad mood or an intense emotional state. Resisting social influence. In the fall of 2017, the Me Too movement erupted, norms and awareness shifted, and many people who previously turned a blind eye toward or stayed silent about efforts to cover up wrongdoing suddenly refused to do so. Many people did so in the face of considerable pressure from their harassers and employers not to step forward. Fox under fire, O'Reilly sexual harassment accusations, Wendy Walsh, psychologist. Tuning into the learner, Milgram directed his initial efforts at increasing the forces that compelled people to want to terminate the experiment and stop hurting the learner. These forces were all triggered by an awareness of the learner's suffering, so Milgram tried to increase them by making the learner more prominent, or, in his words, by tuning in the learner. Participants spontaneously tried to do the opposite, that is, to deal with their own discomfort by tuning out the learner, sometimes literally turning away from him in their chair. As already noted, in the remote feedback version of the experiment, the teacher, the participant, could neither see nor hear the learner, except for one episode of vigorous pounding, and in the voice feedback version, the learner was still not in view, but he and his vigorous protests were clearly audible, and the teacher was constantly aware of him. In subsequent variations of the experiment, Milgram introduced the proximity version, in which the learner received a shock in the same room where the teacher delivered it, from only 1.5 feet away, as well as a touch proximity version, in which the teacher was required to force the learner's hand onto the shock plate. A sheet of insulation supposedly kept the teacher from being shocked too. Figure 9.10 shows the effect of these manipulations. As the learner became more and more present and real, the teachers found it increasingly difficult to deliver the shocks, and obedience rates diminished. In touch with the learner, in a touch proximity version of Milgram's original experiment, participants were required to force the learner's hand onto the shock plate, which reduced the participants' obedience rates. Figure 9.10, tuning in the learner. The effect of Milgram's experimental manipulations that made the learner more and more salient on A, the mean level of shock participants delivered, and B, the percentage of participants who deliver the maximum amount of shock. As the signal coming from the learner got stronger, obedience declined. Okay, on the left you can see the x-axis goes on the left from remote feedback to voice feedback to proximity to touch proximity, so increasing the presence of the man being shocked. And then you can see the mean level of shock the participant experimented goes down the closer the man being shocked is to them. The closer the teachers were to the learner, physically and psychologically, the less shock they tended to administer. Okay, in B, you can see on the x-axis the same four conditions: remote feedback, voice feedback, proximity, and touch proximity, increasing the presence of the man being shocked, and the percentage delivering the maximum shock is on the y-axis. So you can see it, the closer the man being shocked gets, the less people deliver the maximum shock, all the way from about 65% in the remote feedback condition to only 30%, less than half that in the touch proximity condition. The closer the teachers were to the learner, physically and psychologically, the less likely they were to administer the maximum shock. One lesson to be drawn from this experiment is chilling. The more removed we are from others, the easier it is to hurt them. Consider, for example, military combat, which is often no longer hand-to-hand. A mere push of a button can release a Hellfire missile from a Predator drone and strike a target a continent away. The remoteness of the victims in such cases makes the harm done to them abstract, so the emotional consequences of aggression are weakened dramatically, and people find it easier to harm others than they would if they had any kind of direct contact with the victims. Or consider how much more remote our communications are online rather than face-to-face. The indirectness of online communication has been cited as one reason for the prevalence of cyberbullying. 2014. Tuning out the victim. Missiles can be fired from a drone, pilotless aircraft by a person located thousands of miles away. This distance can make the harm more abstract, making orders to fire less likely to be questioned. Tuning out the experimenter. Another way Milgram influenced the rate of obedience was to strengthen or weaken the signal coming from the experimenter, thereby strengthening or weakening the forces encouraging participants to complete the experiment. In the standard version of the study, the experimenter was present in the same room, right next to the participant. In an experimenter-absent version, the experimenter gave the initial instructions alongside the participant, but then left the room and issued all subsequent orders over the telephone. By physically removing himself from the scene, the experimenter lost much of his influence, and participants were less likely to obey. Another way to diminish the experimenter's power is to alter the experimenter's authority. In one version, for example, instead of an authoritative experimenter, an ordinary person, seemingly another participant, but in reality a confederate, was the one who delivered the orders to increase the shock level each time the learner made a mistake. In still another version, two experimenters initially instructed the participant to shock the learner. At one point, however, one of the two experimenters announced that he found the proceedings objectionable and argued with the other experimenter, who continued to urge the participant to complete the experiment. Figure 9.11, see page 302, shows the results of these manipulations. As the experimenter became less salient and less of an authority in the participant's mind, it became easier for the participant to defy him, so the rate of obedience declined. Notice that the series of experimental variations had a more pronounced effect than the tuning in the learner series. Compare figures 9.10 and 9.11, making it easier for participants to disobey. For example, by decreasing the authority or power of the experimenter, thus seems to be more effective than increasing their desire to obey. For example, by making the learner's protestations and pain more real. This distinction provides an important clue to understanding the surprising levels of obedience observed in Milgram's experiments. Would you have obeyed? Nobody anticipated the widespread levels of obedience Milgram observed. A group of psychiatrists predicted that fewer than 1% of all participants at pathological fringe would continue until they delivered the maximum amount of shock. This failure of prediction is matched by an equally noteworthy failure of after-the-fact insight. The vast majority of people believe, even after hearing the basic results and all the study variations, that they themselves would never deliver very high levels of shock. Thus, although Milgram's experimental variations shed light on when and why people engage in such surprising behavior, they don't provide a fully satisfying explanation, or else we would be more likely to accept that we ourselves might obey in the same situation. As Lee Ross put it, the experiments do not pass a critical empathy test, 1988. They don't lead us to empathize fully with the obedient participants and take seriously the possibility that we would also obey to the end, as most participants did. A truly satisfying explanation might not convince us that we would surely obey, but it should at least convince us that we might act that way. Figure 9.11, tuning out the experimenter. The effect of Milgram's experimental manipulations that made the experimenter less and less salient on A, the mean level of shock participants delivered, and B, the percentage of participants who delivered the maximum amount of shock. As the signal coming from the experimenter got weaker, obedience declined. Okay, so on the x-axis, first is on the left is baseline, then absent experimenter, then ordinary person experimenter, then contradictory experimenters, and on the y-axis is mean level of shock from 0 to 500. And you can see the farther the experimenter gets away from the person administering the shocks, the lower level of shock they will administer. So in the baseline, they administer like 400, and by the time you get to the contradictory experimenters, they only administer 150. The weaker the signal coming from the experimenter, the less shock the teachers tended to administer. Okay, so you can see the same x-axis. On the left is baseline to absent experimenter to ordinary person experimenter to contradictory experimenters. So the experimenter gets farther and farther away. And on the y-axis, you have the percentage delivering maximum shock from 0 to 70%. So you can see in the baseline, about 65% deliver the maximum shock, and the absent experimenter only 20%. The ordinary person experimenter also only 20%. And at the contradictory experimenters, no one uses the maximum shock. The weaker the signal coming from the experimenter, the less likely the teachers were to administer the maximum shock. Milgram's work is often mentioned in discussions of how people sometimes obey the directives of malevolent government officials and engage in sadistic, demeaning torture, such as that observed at Abu Ghraib, or commit hideous crimes against humanity, such as those witnessed during the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, in the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, or in the massacres in Cambodia, Rwanda, or Darfur. Explanations of such incomprehensible cruelties vary along an exceptionalist-normalist continuum. The exceptionalist thesis is that such crimes are perpetrated only by exceptional people, that is, exceptionally sadistic, desperate, or ethnocentric people. Many Germans were virulent anti-Semites. The Serbs harbored long-standing hatred and resentment against the Bosnians. The Rwandan Hutus had a score to settle with the Tutsis. The normalist thesis, in contrast, is that most people are capable of such destructive obedience, and given the right circumstances, almost anyone would commit such acts. Box 9.4. Milgram's research, of course, is typically taken to support the normalist position. Milgram himself certainly took that position. When Morley Safer, on the CBS TV show 60 Minutes, asked whether he thought something like the Holocaust could happen in the United States, Milgram offered this opinion. I would say, on the basis of having observed 1,000 people in the experiment and having my own intuition shaped and informed by these experiments, that if a system of death camps were set up in the United States of the sort we had seen in Nazi Germany, one would be able to find sufficient personnel for those camps in any medium-sized American town. Box 9.4. Focus on today. Would Milgram get the same results now? Milgram's studies were done in the early 1960s, but that was then, this is now. If you conducted Milgram's experiments today, would you get the same results? Some argue that today's more intense media coverage of such events as domestic spying by the U.S. National Security Agency, along with constant claims of fake news by President Trump, have made people less trusting of authority and thus less likely to obey instructions to harm another individual. Perhaps, but that's a difficult idea to test because ethical concerns make it impossible to replicate Milgram's experiments today. All psychological research must now be approved by an institutional review board, whose responsibility is to make sure any proposed research wouldn't cause undue stress to the participants or harm them in any way. See Chapter 2. Few, if any, IRBs would approve a direct replication of Milgram's experiments. Jerry Berger, at Santa Clara University in California, did the next best thing by conducting a near replication of Milgram's basic experiment to investigate whether the tendency to obey authority has changed since Milgram's time. Berger identified a critical moment in the original proceedings when disobedience was most likely, right after the participant had supposedly delivered 150 volts of electric shock, and the learner protested and demanded to be released. It was something of a now or never moment. 4 out of 5 of Milgram's participants who didn't stop at this point never stopped at all. Berger saw an opportunity. It would be ethically unacceptable to put people through the stress of deciding between disobeying the experimenter and administering 300 or 400 volts of electricity. But the procedure isn't so stressful, and thus is more ethically acceptable, up to the 150 volt level. Until that point, Milgram's learner hadn't protested, so the pain caused by the shocks, the participants would presume, can't be that bad. Berger therefore sought and received permission from Santa Clara's IRB to replicate Milgram's basic experiment up to that point only. The results were essentially the same as those obtained by Milgram himself. In Berger's study, 70% of the participants were willing to administer the next level of shock, 165 volts, after hearing the learner's protest. This compares with 82% of Milgram's participants, not a statistically significant difference. Men and women were equally likely to continue past the critical 150-volt level. Today, people seem to react to pressure to obey the same way they did more than 50 years ago. Revisiting Milgram, in Berger's 2009 near replication of the original Milgram experiments from the 1960s, participants faced the same conflict over whether to administer increasing levels of shock, up to 165 volts, to the learner or to call a halt to his suffering by refusing to continue. B. Berger used the same type of bogus shock generator used by Milgram. Let's take a closer look. They tried but failed. One reason people think they would never behave like the average participant in Milgram's studies is that they misunderstand exactly how the average participant behaved. People conjure up images of participants casually going along with the experimenter's commands, increasing the shock level from trial to trial, and being relatively inattentive to the learner's situation. Indeed, Milgram's experiments have often been described as demonstrations of blind obedience, but that's not what happened. Participants didn't blindly obey. Nearly all tried to disobey in one form or another. Nearly everyone called the experimenter's attention to the learner's suffering in an implicit plea to stop the proceedings. Many stated explicitly that they refused to continue, but nonetheless went on with the experiment. Some got out of their chair in defiance, only to sit back down moments later. Most participants tried to disobey, but they weren't particularly good at it. As Ross pointed out, the Milgram experiments have less to say about destructive obedience than about ineffective and indecisive disobedience. This distinction is critical. Most of us have had the experience of having good intentions, but not being able to translate those intentions into effective action. For instance, maybe you've wanted to speak up more forcefully and effectively against racist or sexist remarks, but were too slow to respond, or the words didn't come out as forthrightly as you intended. Or maybe you've wanted to reach out to someone who was being ignored at a party, but you were distracted by your own social needs. Most of us can relate to being good-hearted but ineffective, but most of us can't relate to being uncaring. A chilling parallel to the behavior of Milgram's participants is the behavior of some of the German soldiers called on to execute Polish Jews during World War II. Members of German Reserve Police Battalion 101 were mostly men who hoped to avoid the inevitable violence of the war by volunteering for police duty in Hamburg. After the invasion of Poland, however, they were reassigned to serve as military police in occupied Poland. Most of their duties consisted of routine police work, but on July 13, 1942, the men were roused from their barracks before dawn and taken to the outskirts of the village Josephau, where they were given gruesome orders to round up all the Jewish men, women, and children from the village, send all able-bodied young men to a work camp, and shoot the rest. Most were shocked and repelled by their orders. Many resisted, but their resistance, like that of Milgram's participants, was feeble. Some kept busy with petty errands or moved to the back of the battalion, hoping to avoid being called on. Others took part in the roundup, but then refrained from shooting if no one was watching. Still others fired but missed intentionally. What they didn't do was state assertively that they wouldn't participate or that what they were being asked to do was wrong. They tried to find an easy way to disobey, but there was no easy way, and so they obeyed. Of course, many of the acts of genocide during the Holocaust were perpetrated by individuals who, unlike most of the soldiers in Reserve Police Battalion 101, fully embraced what they were doing. In the case of Milgram's experiments, participants had trouble halting the proceedings, partly because the experimenter wasn't playing by the normal rules of social life. The participants offered reasons for stopping the experiments, but the experimenter largely ignored those reasons, making minimally responsive statements such as, "The experiment requires that you continue." Participants were confused and uncertain about how to act. As we noted in our earlier discussion of conformity, people tend not to act decisively when they lack a solid grasp of the events happening around them. What should you do when told to deliver electric shock to teach someone who's no longer trying to learn anything, at the insistence of an authority figure who seems unconcerned about the learner's predicament? How do you respond when events have stopped making sense? These questions have important implications for those real-world instances of destructive obedience with which we should be most concerned. Many of the most hideous episodes of genocide, for example, have occurred right after large-scale social upheaval. Without reliable norms of appropriate behavior, people are less able to muster the confidence necessary to take decisive action to stop such atrocities.